from the blackest corners of your mind, they call, pulling you deep into shadow, twisting your senses, keeping you from sleep. It's time to face your darkest fears. This is Tales to Terrify. Good evening, children of the night, and welcome. With the new year in full swing, we're elbow deep in cooking up a few things for your horror-swilling pleasure. The first of which, our yearly flash fiction contest, we'll be announcing in a couple of weeks. The theme this year is a personal favorite of mine, so I'm extra excited to read what terrors you birth with it. Keep your ears sharp and your eyes on our social media for some hints about the theme and to be the first to know when it's announced. Tonight, we have one tale for you about a vampire feud in the shadows of ancient Rome. Our story tonight comes to us from Keira Reynolds. Keira Reynolds writes computer code by day and, mostly, fantasy stories by night. She's had stories published in Little Blue Marble, Andromeda Spaceways magazine, All Worlds Wayfarer, and elsewhere. She's just completed a degree in Arts and Humanities with a specialization in creative writing with the Open University and is anxiously awaiting the results. She lives in County Kerry, Ireland, with her wife Julie, 2 border collies, and 3 cats, and occasionally posts random thoughts on her blog at KeiraReynolds.com. Children of the night, join me for Keira Reynolds' The Thirst, a Tales to Terrify original.
Seven of Tertia's most beautiful slaves, 3 men, 3 women, and 1 particularly gorgeous creature who defied categorization, were entwined naked on the floor before Tertia's silk-cushioned divan, doing all kinds of interesting things to each other, when Iulia walked into the room. At least Iulia found the things they were doing interesting. Tertia looked bored, but then Tertia always appeared to be bored, which was odd, really. Anyone would think Tertia was the one who was thousands of years old and had seen everything. Iulia! Tertia jumped up and clapped her hands, boredom cast aside, and ran forward with arms spread, stepping on one of the naked slaves in her eagerness to embrace Iulia. Welcome! Come sit beside me, I have the most frightful news to share. Iulia returned the embrace and kissed Tertia, then settled onto the divan closest to the one where Tertia had been reclining. Her own slave, Germanus, took up position behind the divan. She had left the other 4 outside. It was considered poor form to bring an armed retinue into the home of a friend. It showed a lack of trust. Iulia wasn't sure if Tertia was a friend, exactly, but she was at least fairly sure Tertia wasn't planning to kill her. She didn't have any reason to. And Tertia was unlikely to become too curious about why she only ever saw Iulia after the sun went down, as she was seldom up before midday herself, though for very different reasons. Do share, said Iulia, kicking off her sandals and reclining on the divan. I'm all ears. Another slave appeared and offered wine and a plate of cheese and dates, which Iulia accepted with a smile. her fingers stroking the girl's hand as she took the goblet. "You won't believe what happened to Calvus," said Tertia, resuming her place on the divan. "Won't I?" "No, they found him dead in his bed this morning. Murdered." "Really?" Yulia felt a twinge of anxiety, but dismissed it. Mortals died. It was the definition of being mortal, after all. And Tertia was prone to exaggeration. It was probably nothing. "That is strange. Who'd want to kill poor Calvus? He wasn't terribly bright. I always thought poor Sabina could have done better for herself, but he was quite harmless. I can't imagine he had any real enemies. Are they sure it was murder and not an accident?" "Quite sure. They say his throat was cut, and that's not the strangest part." "No?" "No. They said there was no blood in his body. It was drained dry." Germanus grunted, then tried, not very convincingly, to smother the sound with a cough. Yulia kept her face calm and her body relaxed, giving no outward sign of her sudden inner tension. She'd have to flog Germanus later. She didn't particularly enjoy flogging her slaves. Well, except for the ones who enjoyed it. But that was a different matter. But slips like this could not go unpunished. She had too many secrets to hide. She could not afford careless slaves. "Well," she said, "that's to be expected, isn't it, when someone's throat is cut? I mean, so I would imagine." "I suppose so," said Tertia. She didn't appear to have noticed Germanus's reaction, which was not a surprise. Slaves were in general beneath her notice, and she tended only to notice them if they weren't where she wanted them to be when she wanted them to be there. "But they say there was very little blood on the body or on the bed or, well, anywhere, really. It was as though it had been spirited away." "What about Sabina?" "She was away visiting her family. Else I suppose she'd have been killed too. She found him when she got home." "Perhaps we should go and pay our respects." Tertia seemed momentarily surprised by the suggestion, but then her face lit up. "Oh, yes, and perhaps learn some more news, yes. Do let's go, right now." She leapt from the divan, clapping her hands, and yelled at her slaves, sending one to fetch her cloak and sandals, and another to summon her litter-bearers and bodyguard. In her eagerness, she seemed to forget about the naked slaves writhing on the floor, who hesitated, unsure if they were supposed to stop or continue. "Perhaps you should let them rest," suggested Yulia. "They'll be better able to entertain you later if you don't exhaust them while you're gone." "What? Who? Oh, them. Yes, you can all take a rest and go clean yourselves up. Dear Yulia, you're so thoughtful. You think of everyone, even the slaves." "Actually, I'm being quite selfish. I'm hoping you'll agree to sell me one or two of the prettiest one day, and I'd prefer they don't wear themselves out first." They shared a litter for the short journey from Tertia's villa to Sabina's, and found interesting ways to pass the time. Tertia was very beautiful, not nearly as silly as she liked to pretend, and very, very imaginative. Germanus and a big slave called Cecilius, who was Tertia's head bodyguard, walked in front of the litter, clearing the way. The plebeians parted before them like waves before the prow of a galley. Germanus announced them to Sabina's doorkeeper, and they were soon ushered inside. Germanus and Cecilius accompanied their mistresses, while the other slaves waited outside. "Do you think we're in any danger?" wondered Tertia. "The killer might still be here." "Germanus is very capable, as I'm sure is Cecilius. I'm not entirely defenceless myself, and neither, my dear, are you. I've shared enough intimate moments with you to know where you hide the knives." They found Sabina, still weeping, surrounded by people who had come to offer their condolences, to gawk at the dead body of Calvus, to share gossip, to find some unscrupulous way of taking advantage of the newly bereaved widow, or some combination of some of all of these. Yulia quickly and quietly took charge, extracting Sabina from the crowd and leading her to another room. Some tried to follow, but when their eyes met Yulia's, they invariably remembered that they had somewhere else they needed to be. "Thank you," Sabina sighed, sinking into the van to which Yulia led her. I haven't been able to get away from them. They've been hovering around, all talking at once ever since I found him. Oh, Yulia, Tertia, I don't know what to do." "It's all right now," Yulia assured her. "We're here now, and we're going to help you, aren't we, Tertia?" "What? Oh, yes, of course. Dear Sabina, you poor thing. You must tell us. Do you know who did it? Or why?" Sabina began to cry again. "No, I don't know. Who would do such a thing? I've had the slaves beaten, of course. They must have been involved. If they didn't do it themselves, they must know who did. But they contradict each other so. I can get no sense out of them. Each one blames another. I'll have to sell them all to the salt mines, but then I'll have to buy new ones. I don't know how I can cope with it all, or who I can trust. I'll be ruined if I don't wake up with my own throat cut like poor Calvus. What am I to do?" "I can help you there," Yulia assured her. "I have quite expensive business interests. I can always use more slaves. I'll pay you a fair price for them, unlike those thieves at the salt mines who would rob you. You'll stay with Tertia tonight, and Tertia and I will have some of our own slaves guard this place and look after you until you can find new ones. Won't we, Tertia?" "We will. There, you see, it's all taken care of." "Dear Yulia, thank you so much. How will I ever repay you?" "There's no need. Don't worry about it. Now, if you don't mind, I should go and pay my respects to poor Calvus." "Are you sure you want to do that? The morticians have been with him, but it's still a dreadful sight. I found him lying there, half out of bed, with his poor throat. Oh, I can't bear to think about it." She started to cry again. "He was a good friend in life," said Yulia. "It wouldn't be right not to pay my respects." Calvus had never, in fact, been a particularly good friend, to her or to anyone else, but no one was going to say that now that he was dead. They left Germanus and Cecilius to guard Sabina and discourage other visitors, and stepped into the room where Calvus's body lay. A length of silk had been wrapped around his neck to hide the wound. Yulia slipped a finger under the silk and pulled it down far enough to see the wound. Just as they had been told, the throat had been cut, but she noted the dry yellowish appearance that told her the wound was post-mortem. Looking more closely, she could see what, so far, no one else had noticed, or if they had not realized the significance. Separated now by the gash of the severed throat were two small puncture wounds. Unlike the knife gash, they were red and wet. The throat had been cut to obscure them and conceal the real circumstances of the death. She pulled back the sheet that covered the body, making even Tertia gasp. The body was covered with the bluish-purple patches of livor mortis. Calvus had indeed been drained of blood, but not through the knife gash. Later, in the swaying litter on the way back to Tertia's villa, Tertia turned to Yulia and regarded her quizzically with one eyebrow raised. "You're being awfully nice to Sabina," she said. "I didn't realize you cared so much for her." "I intend to make a healthy profit from reselling those slaves she sold me." "Yes, I'm sure you do." Tertia's tone and expression indicated that she didn't believe for a moment that this was Yulia's only motive. Yulia considered warning Tertia that digging deeper into the matter might prove unhealthy, but that would only confirm that there was something to dig into. So instead, she turned to face Tertia, covered those pouty pink lips with her own, and slid her hands under those filmy silk robes. Tertia's curiosity might be insatiable, but so was her lust. Back home at last in her own villa, with its windows shuttered and heavily draped against the approaching dawn, Yulia sent for Sabina's former door slave, now in her possession along with most of Sabina's other slaves. Germanus, and another of Yulia's slaves, a big Gaul named Tacitus, marched the man in between them, naked and with his arms bound behind his back. He was a big, heavily muscled man. He'd have to be. As a door slave, one of his chief functions was to be a human watchdog. He looked as though imagination might not be one of his strongest attributes, but Yulia had made sure it didn't have to be. When Germanus and Tacitus brought him into the room, she was seated on a cushioned chair. scantily dressed in flowing sheer silk, with a small stone table beside her. On the table was a set of thumbscrews, a small but very sharp knife, and a brazier of hot coals with a branding iron heating in it. "What's your name?" she said. "Cypranius, ma'am." The man's eyes flickered from the instruments of torture to a Julia and back again. "Look at me, Cypranus," she ordered. He did so. She let her own eyes travel the length of his naked, sweating body, from head to toe and back again, before meeting his gaze and holding it. She picked up the knife and rose, crossing the room in a few steps to stand before him. She could smell his fear, hear his heart racing, see the arteries pulsing in his neck. She brought the knife to her lips and licked the blade, while her other hand dragged a long claw-like nail down his belly. "Tell me everything," she said. And he did. He told a disjointed, sometimes confused, sometimes contradictory story about a mysterious, nameless, veiled mistress who visited Calvus at night whenever Sabina was away. Julia listened, asked occasional questions, and when he had no more to tell, she pressed her silk-clad body against him, draped her arms over his shoulders, sank her fangs into his throat, and drained him dry. The kiss, the kindred called it. Such a mundane little word for an experience so profound. The kiss was more than food and drink to the kindred, more than sex, more than drugs. It was everything. When she finally withdrew her fangs from Cypranus' throat and stepped back, leaving him hanging lifelessly between the two big men who held him, she was shivering with ecstasy, delicious little aftershocks coursing through her body. Everything else, food, drink, sex, love, hate, revenge, it all lost its edge after a few thousand years. The kiss never did. "Germanus," she said, when she could speak again, "you've earned yourself a flogging tonight." "Yes, ma'am." "Here's an opportunity to redeem yourself. Dispose of this," she indicated the lifeless body of Cypranus. "Then investigate his story. Find out who Calvus's mysterious mistress is, and make sure no word of your interest gets back to her. Report to me when I wake tonight. Do well, and you may yet escape that flogging." "Yes, ma'am." Germanus left, dragging the lifeless body of Cypranus behind him, and Julia retired to her haven, a closely guarded, windowless room where no sunlight could reach her. There had been gaps in Cypranus' memory, things he could not remember, things he had seen but could not describe. She had wasted no time trying to torture the knowledge out of him. She rarely resorted to actual physical torture. There was no need. The threat, combined with the overwhelming compulsion of her predatory presence, was usually enough. When that failed, torture was unlikely to succeed. The gaps in the man's memory were genuine. She knew, because she had created just such gaps in the memory of other men and women, when the need arose. It was one of the ways the kindred survived and stayed hidden. The presence of such gaps itself told a story. It confirmed what she had suspected was true. There was another kindred in the city, a powerful one. That in itself was worrying enough. What was worse was that this mysterious, powerful kindred had not been content to merely feed from Calvus, but had drained him dry and then clumsily attempted to cover up the mistake while leaving the body to be found. It was one thing to drain a slave like Cypranus. Slaves were disposable. Germanus would feed his body to the swine, and no one would notice his passing. But to drain an equestrian like Calvus, and leave his body to be found, indicated a loss of control that was alarming. That kind of carelessness drew attention. And Julia had survived for millennia only by carefully avoiding unwanted attention. She intended to continue doing so, which meant that this careless kindred, whoever they were, would have to be dealt with. She'd be damned if... She smiled to herself at the irony as the day sleep washed over her. She was damned regardless, of course. but she wasn't going down without a fight. She slept deeply, but not peacefully. To mortals, the kindred were creatures of nightmare, terrifying and almost invincible. It would have surprised most mortals to learn that the kindred were plagued by nightmares of their own, more frequent and more dreadful than most mortals could imagine. It was not easy to sleep peacefully, with the knowledge that until the sun set again, one was completely helpless, and that one might, if discovered, never wake, or worse, wake to find a mortal hunter bent over one with a stake aimed at one's heart. But the two things that tormented the dreams of the kindred above all else were fire and sunlight. Many a kindred woke at sunset screaming, emerging from dreams in which their haven was burning while they lay conscious but unable to move, or in which the walls were crumbling, admitting shafts of sunlight that crept across the floors and walls, drawing slowly nearer. Kindred without resources were forced to seek out hidden places into which they hoped that mortals would not venture. Caves, abandoned tombs, sewers. Those who survived long enough to gain wealth and influence sought to buy security in the forms of villas and mansions, guarded during the day by mortals like Germanus and Tacitus. Most of Julia's slaves were just that, mortal slaves bound to her only by the difficulty of escape and the harsh punishments visited on those who tried. But Germanus and Tacitus, and a few others, were bound to her by stronger ties. A few drops of her blood once a month filled them with strength and energy beyond that of other mortals, and prolonged their life and youth. It was an addiction they could not break, even if they desired to, and they did not. It made them loyal to her in a way no mortal enemy could challenge. Only another equally powerful kindred might possibly be able to bribe them away from her. And so she slept, and dreamed restlessly, while Tacitus stood guard over her sleeping body in the windowless room hidden away at the rear of the villa. And while she slept and Tacitus watched, Germanus and the slaves under his command went out into the streets and the markets and the baths, and they asked questions, and paid bribes, and made promises and threats, and they listened, and they watched. By the time Julia woke that night, they had a name for her. Valentina. She left the sanctuary of her villa as early as she dared, while the sun had not yet fully set. Wrapped and hooded, she huddled in her heavily draped litter and prayed that her litter-bearers would not stumble, that they would not encounter a fire, a riot, or a bolting horse. There were a frightening number of things that could go wrong, and all it would take would be one broken wooden plank or one torn curtain, and she would die in unspeakable agony, burned to ashes by the last rays of the setting sun. But she had to take the chance. She had to reach Valentina's haven as early as possible, before Valentina was fully awake. While she was, hopefully, still groggy from the day sleep, and not yet in possession of her full faculties. There were sounds of struggle in the courtyard of Valentina's villa, as Julia's slaves and thralls fought with Valentina's. Julia could do nothing but crouch in the litter and wait and pray that no one stumbled into the litter and overturned it in the confusion. Germanus had reported that Valentina had, as far as he could ascertain, only a few slaves. Her own force was the larger and should in theory have little difficulty overcoming Valentina's forces. Unless, of course, Germanus had been misled. Valentina had more slaves than expected, perhaps hidden inside the villa, ready to rush out and reinforce their comrades when needed. Or unless more of them than expected turned out to be thralls, strengthened and invigorated by Valentina's blood. If either of these things happened, then defeat was entirely possible. Julia snarled at the thought, her fangs grazing her lower lip and her fingers curling into claws. The frustration of being able to do nothing but wait was almost unbearable. The sounds of struggle ended. Footsteps approached the litter. "It's over, ma'am." Germanus's voice. "We'll move the litter closer to the door. The sun is almost gone now." The litter rose, swayed for a few moments, and was set down again. She risked a peek through the drapes. The litter had been set down within inches of the open doorway into the villa. The outer rooms were open and airy. with large windows opening onto the roofless central atrium. But with the sun sinking now behind the surrounding buildings, there were shadows enough for her to leave the litter as long as she avoided errant shafts of light. She drew her hooded cloak about her and slipped quickly out of the litter, through the open doorway and into a shadowed corner. The elite of the city were not known for imagination and innovation when it came to the planning of their villas. They all followed much the same basic plan, which made it easy for her to guess where Valentina's haven might be. The one room in the villa that was most secure against daylight. She met surprisingly little resistance inside the villa. A few mortal slaves attempted to bar her way, but were easily overwhelmed by her own thralls and slaves. This was all going much easier than she expected. Had Valentina no powerful thralls to defend her? Perhaps she had neglected them, or even turned on them and fed on them. Perhaps she had thought she no longer needed them. That was what happened when kindred lived for millennia. They became careless, overconfident, and complacent. She opened a door. "Hello, Yulia," said Valentina. "I've been expecting you." Yulia took a step into the room and to one side, leaving the doorway free for Germanus to lead the slaves into the room. She frowned as she noted that he remained behind her instead of coming forward. Keeping her eyes on Valentina, she gestured Germanus forward, but he did not respond. Valentina smiled. "We really don't have to be enemies, you know," said Valentina. "You think I'm a threat to you because I refuse to skulk in the shadows any longer. You fear I will bring down the wrath of the mortals upon us, but together we can bring down our wrath upon them. Why should we fear them? We are so much stronger than them. Let them fear us." "That's the beast talking," said Yulia, while she silently signalled to Germanus again. "You think you've had a revelation, but you have simply lost control. You think you're the first to see the truth, but I've heard it many times before. Countless kindred before you have thought we were strong enough to openly rule the mortals. None of them survive. You overlook the fact that while individually we are strong, we are few, and they are many, and they don't fear the light." Something was very wrong. It wasn't just that Valentina lounged on a divan, smiling and unalarmed. That was the way of the kindred. But there was something about that small smile, something more than the usual kindred arrogance, something that said Valentina knew something that Yulia didn't, something that she had overlooked. That was when Germanus stabbed her in the back. The blow hit her like a hammer between the shoulders. Pain shot through her like a fire in her chest. She folded at the knees and hips and fell, hitting her face hard on the tiled floor. She lay dazed, her head turned to one side, looking up at Valentina, who still lounged on her divan with that small, knowing smile on her full red lips. Kindred, being undead, were hard to kill. Beheading would do it, or fire, or sunlight. A wooden stake through the heart would not kill, but would put a kindred into a state of stupor, to remain unconscious until the stake was removed. Otherwise, most blows, cuts, and stabbings were of little consequence. A stake. It had to be a wooden stake, but Germanus had missed her heart, or she would not be conscious. She could feel it now, in her chest, grating on her ribs. It had pierced her lungs, but that didn't worry her much, as she didn't really need to breathe. What worried her more was that Germanus was still standing over her. If he realised he'd botched the job, he might try again, and he might get it right this time. She lay very still and made no sound. She could see some of her other slaves and thralls scattered around the room, but none of them were making any move to come to her aid. She didn't blame them. They were here to fight Valentina's slaves and thralls, not Valentina herself. No mortal, even a thrall, was any match for a kindred. The final confrontation was always going to be between Yulia and Valentina. With Yulia incapacitated, there was nothing for her slaves and thralls to do but surrender and beg for mercy. "Good boy," Valentina purred. "I can see why Yulia valued you so highly. It's just unfortunate for her, and fortunate for me, that I valued you more." but I don't think you've quite finished the task. I believe I see her eyes moving. I trust you brought more than one steak." Yulia twisted, looking up at Germanus, who stared at her in momentary surprise, before reaching under his cloak, presumably for another steak. She rolled away and climbed to her feet, steadying herself with one hand against the wall, crying out in pain as the sudden movement caused the steak to grate against her ribs again. Germanus had another steak in his hand now, and was approaching her cautiously, and out of the corner of her eye she saw Valentina slide like a snake off the divan and stalk towards her. She was in danger of being encircled, with Germanus approaching her from the front, and Valentina moving around to attack from behind. She bared her fangs and lunged at Germanus. Weakened and in pain as she was, she failed to strike, but Germanus flinched back away from her towards the open door and stumbled into a cloaked and hooded figure that stepped out of the shadows into the doorway. A heavy wooden cudgel cracked against Germanus's skull, and he crumpled to the floor. The figure in the doorway threw back the hood to reveal the face of Tacitus, who nodded calmly and respectfully, as though nothing untoward had happened. "Ma'am," was all he said. She had no time to respond. She whirled to face Valentina, who leapt at her, fangs bared and claw-like fingers grasping. Valentina moved with impossible speed, crossing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. Yulia had thought herself fast, but she had no hope of evading Valentina. Before she could react, one of Valentina's arms was around her waist. The other grabbed a handful of her hair and forced her head back, and Valentina's fangs grazed her throat. "I'm going to drain you dry," whispered Valentina. "I'll drink your blood and your soul. You'll be mine forever." "A word to the wise," Yulia growled, as she reached up behind her back and her fingers closed around the wooden stake jutting out between her shoulders. "If you plan to kill a kindred, don't talk about it. Just do it." She yanked out the stake, crying out as agony flared in her chest, and stabbed Valentina through the heart. Valentina's eyes fluttered and rolled back in her head. Her knees folded. Yulia held her close and slowly lowered her to the floor. She looked down at the unconscious kindred for a moment, then reached out and gently closed Valentina's eyelids with the tips of her fingers. "Wrap her in a rug," she told her slaves. "Bring her with us." She turned to face those of Valentina's slaves and thralls who still lived. "You belong to me now," she told them. "Any objections?" A hurried chorus assured her that there were none. She turned away from them and walked to where Tacitus stood over the body of Germanus. "I thought I told you to stand watch outside." "Yes, ma'am, but I had a few suspicions about Germanus. Nothing definite, nothing I could report, just suspicions. I took it on myself to follow. Please forgive me, ma'am." "Under the circumstances, yes, I think I can forgive you. You weren't tempted to join him?" "That would have meant, at best, if he succeeded, continuing to serve as his second-in-command, ma'am. Whereas now—" "Yes. It would appear that the position of lead thrall in my household is now vacant, wouldn't it? Consider yourself promoted." "Thank you, ma'am." She looked down at Germanus. "Is he still alive?" Tacitus stooped down and checked. "Yes, ma'am. Would you like me to correct that?" "No rush. Wrap him in a rug and bring him with us, too. I think I'd like to have a rather long conversation with Germanus. After that, well, all this excitement has given me quite an appetite."
That was Keira Reynolds' The Thirst, as read by Georgia Cook. Georgia Cook is an illustrator and writer from London. She has experience on both sides of the recording booth, and in addition to Tales to Terrify, has contributed to such podcasts as The Other Stories and The Night's End, as both a narrator and writer. She can be found on Twitter at Georgia Cooked and on her website at georgiacookwriter.com. Thank you, Georgia. Well, children of the night, the hour is late and we've run out of tales to tell. For now. Tales to Terrify is made possible by the tremendous generosity of our supporters on Patreon and PayPal. Incredible fans like Lestle Baxter, Amanda Carrillo, Amanda Gottfried, and Orion D. Hegre, whose generous support keeps these lights on and flickering ominously. If you're not a supporter, head over to patreon.com/Tales to Terrify. You'll find all kinds of perks, like ad-free episodes, bonus content, and one-of-a-kind collectibles. Every dollar goes back into this show, and we appreciate your support so much. Want another way to support the show that doesn't cost you a cent? Head over to Podchaser, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts and drop us a 5-star review. You'll not only put an unnaturally wide smile on our faces, but help new listeners discover our terrifying tales too. You can show your love of the show out in the world with some Tales to Terrify merch. TalesToTerrify.com/merch will take you to our TeePublic store, where we've got a great collection of creepy custom and curated designs. Tales to Terrify is produced by Seth Williams, Meredith Morgenstern, Andrew Gibson, Crystal Hammond, Spencer Disparty, and myself, Drew Sebastini, with original theme by Nebulous Entertainment. Tales to Terrify is distributed under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Join us again next week as our deepest fears rise from the dead with more Tales to Terrify.